Hey there, good morning. Welcome to Coffee with Connie. Thank you so much for taking the time to tune in. I'm Connie Fuksa with Foote Title Group, where we protect your home ownership and make sure that your closing is a smooth and simple process. So, a lot of times I talk about things with respect to the buyer and buying real estate because that is a lot more involved, the processes and the things that have to happen because there's so many different pieces. But again today, and I've done this a couple times most recently, I want to talk about the seller side because there's a lot of things that the sellers don't really think about until they say, oh gosh, let me put my house on the market. So not just selling, but let's talk about I own a piece of property and I want to make sure that all the pieces are in the right place in case something happens to me, because that's the piece that we never foresee. And maybe, we haven't addressed some of the things that we want to take care of with respect to that property. So let's talk about a couple of pieces. Let's first talk about who owns your property, and are the people that own it the people that you want to make sure have an interest if something happens to you. So let's talk about what that means. So if you bought a piece of property by yourself, let's say when you first got out of college, you decided you wanted to live on your own, you didn't want to move back to mom and dad's, and you were able to get a job, so you decided to buy your first house, and your first house might have been a townhouse or a condo, or maybe it was a single family home, and you bought it by yourself, and then a year or two later, you met someone, you fell in love, you're living together, maybe you're married, maybe you're not, whichever, it doesn't really matter. But do you, now that person is a part of your life, does that person contribute to your mortgage? And if they contribute to your mortgage, do they need to have an ownership interest in that property in case something happens to you? Thank you guys so much for tuning in. I'm going to stop for a second and say, hey, Phil, how are you this morning? Good morning, Kelly. Hey, Kathy, how are you today? Thank you guys so much for tuning in. I really appreciate your time. And if we talk about something interesting and you have a question, let me know. Give me some thumbs up. Also, please share if you find out that the information we're talking about is something that someone else may find interesting. So let's talk about that. So in that scenario, you bought that house or that condo by yourself when you originally got out of college and got your first job. Then you found someone and that person's living with you. You've been living together for a couple of years. Maybe you got married and you've never added that person to the ownership of that property. What happens if something happens to you tomorrow or something happens to you next week and it's a long-term thing and that person is not added to the property? When I say if something happens to you, maybe something doesn't happen to you that ends your life, but maybe something happens to you that ends your ability to control things in your life. And you always intended to have that person. They've been helping with the mortgage. They've been helping with all of the things in the home. It was always your intention that your home would go to that person and that person would have control over their ownership. But if you don't add them to that ownership, that will never happen. So a lot of times I talk about things that come up in everyday activities in our closing office. And so this particular concept came up because here's another scenario with that ownership on the reverse side. We had a gentleman that called last week and he owned a piece of property with his wife. His wife ended up having some drug issues. They ended up getting divorced. They had a divorce decree that said he would take ownership of that property, but they never did a deed. Well, she ended up having more problems, ended up going to jail, ended up passing away. Well, they never took her off the ownership of the property. They are divorced, and now anyone who has an ownership interest in that property, or anybody who has an ownership interest in her estate has an interest in that property. So they never addressed that because they thought that the divorce decree actually handled that because it said, and that in most cases, that's the final word on things with respect to the things that you own when you're married and you get divorced, but not when it comes to property. When it comes to property, you either have to do a court order, which is a whole lot more involved, or doing a deed adding or removing someone to that property. So if you have a piece of property and you have not added the people that you want to have an ownership interest, if something was to happen to you, you need to address that. So maybe you want to make sure, maybe you're a little bit older and you want to make sure that your adult children have an ownership interest if something happens to you, but you don't really want to add somebody because you don't want somebody taking your house or selling a house out from under you. There's lots of ways to get around doing that as well. You can add them to the ownership. You can create what's called a life estate so that you own it without any other interference for as long as you are alive. You can create an ownership interest by doing the way that you own it with someone else stated in the deed. There's lots of different ways you can do that, but by doing that, creating that ownership or taking off that ownership if necessary, if it's a divorce situation, then that actually addresses those things if something was to happen, so that the person that you love or the person that you don't want on the ownership of that property is removed or added, so that nothing has to happen after you get into a situation where you can't act on your own behalf or you're not with us any longer. And if you think that those things, well, it'll happen someday, it could happen tomorrow, it could happen today, it could happen next week. It happens all the time. And unfortunately, it's a tough subject to talk about, but I really encourage you to think about, do the people that you care about have the right and the ownership ability to that property if that's what you intend? Or does the person that you don't intend to have ownership any longer still have an ownership? Are they still listed on the title or the ownership of your property? And if so, you need to get that taken care of. There's a lot of different ways that those things can be addressed, but ultimately, if you want to remove someone from a piece of property, you have to do a deed taking them off. If you want to add someone to the ownership of the property, you have to do a deed adding them. All of those things are very simple for us to do for you. So we can certainly help you in Maryland or Virginia take care of those things to make sure that your affairs are in the proper place. And what you want is what's going to happen if something was to happen to you. So if I gave you a little nugget today that maybe spurred a question or maybe answered some information for you, reach out and let me know if you have questions. There's anything I can help you with. If you go on our website, www.foottetitlegroup.com, and go to the Sellers tab, on the Sellers tab, there's a drop down and it says resources. There's also helpful links. There's all kinds of information on there for you that can help you through some of these questions, or you can reach out to any of our team members in Maryland or Virginia. They all are well versed in both states and can help you answer any of those questions, or message me through Facebook or individually, and I'd be happy to answer any of those questions for you. And if you felt like what we were talking about was valuable, please hit that little share button, because there's probably somebody in your circle that might have some of the same questions. Thank you guys so much for tuning in this morning. I really appreciate it. I always look forward to talking to you. And if there's anything I can help you with, please reach out to me, Connie at footetitlegroup.com, or message me through Facebook. Hope you guys have a fantastic day, and I'll talk to you again real soon.